In November 1918, Germany lay defeated. Its armies were collapsing, people were starving, and revolution was sweeping through its cities. The Treaty of Versailles would soon strip Germany of territory, force it to pay crushing reparations, and limit its military to a mere 100,000 men with no tanks, no air force, and no submarines. Germany was supposed to remain weak, unable to threaten Europe again. Yet just 20 years later, in September 1939, German panzer divisions were rolling across Poland with overwhelming force. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The Wehrmacht was the most modern, well-trained, and technologically advanced military machine in the world. Within months, France would fall in just 6 weeks to the same Germany that had failed to defeat it in 4 years of brutal trench warfare. How did this happen? How did Germany transform from a defeated, restricted nation into a military superpower in just 2 decades? The answer is far more complex than simply blaming Hitler or rearmament. It's a story of strategic deception, economic manipulation, secret collaboration with unlikely partners, and the exploitation of every loophole in the treaty that was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. When we picture Germany after World War I, we often imagine a nation utterly destroyed, its industrial capacity shattered, its infrastructure in ruins. This image, while emotionally powerful, is misleading. Understanding the true state of Germany in 1918 is crucial to understanding how they recovered so quickly. Unlike France, whose northeastern industrial heartland had been devastated by 4 years of trench warfare, Germany's industrial infrastructure remained almost entirely intact. Not a single major factory had been bombed. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial powerhouse, continued operating throughout the war. Coal mines, steel mills, and manufacturing plants were damaged only by overuse and lack of maintenance, not by enemy action. The Western Front had been fought almost entirely on French and Belgian soil, not German. This was no accident of geography. Germany's military had managed to keep the fighting away from its industrial centers for the entire war. While France had to rebuild destroyed factories and cities, Germany simply needed to retool and modernize facilities that were already standing. This gave Germany an enormous head start that the Treaty of Versailles did nothing to address. Moreover, Germany's defeat in 1918 came not from invasion but from collapse. The German army remained on foreign soil when the armistice was signed. No Allied soldiers had marched through Berlin. No occupation force had planted flags on German government buildings. To many Germans, this created the psychological space for the stab in the back myth, the belief that Germany hadn't really lost militarily but had been betrayed from within by communists and Jews. While this myth was historically false, it had powerful consequences. It meant that German society never fully internalized the lesson that Allied leaders hoped the war would teach. The Treaty of Versailles attempted to limit Germany militarily, but did remarkably little to limit its industrial capacity. Germany was forced to surrender their colonies and about 13% of their European territory, including Alsace, Lorraine to France and territory to the newly reformed Poland. Germany lost population and resources, certainly, but its core industrial regions remained German. The treaty limited the size of their military and banned certain weapons, but it placed no permanent restrictions on their ability to manufacture steel, chemicals, or precision machinery. These industries could produce peacetime goods easily, but they could also be converted to war production when the time came. There was also the matter of human capital. Germany in 1918 possessed one of the most educated, technically skilled populations in the world. German universities were centers of scientific excellence. German engineers were among the finest. German workers were disciplined and trained. The war had killed millions of German men, certainly, but it hadn't destroyed the educational system, the technical knowledge, or the industrial expertise that made Germany a great power. You can destroy a factory, but you cannot easily destroy a culture of engineering excellence. Germany retained that culture. The Treaty of Versailles was specific in its military restrictions. Germany's army was limited to 100,000 men, serving long-term contracts to prevent the creation of a trained reserve. The general staff was to be dissolved. Germany was forbidden to possess tanks, military aircraft, or submarines. Their navy was reduced to a token coastal defense force. An Allied Control Commission would verify compliance. On paper, these restrictions should have kept Germany militarily weak for generations. In practice, the German military found creative ways to circumvent nearly every restriction. often with tacit Allied knowledge and sometimes with Allied assistance. The most important loophole was that while the treaty restricted military forces, it said nothing about military training, doctrine development, or officer education. The German army might be limited to 100,000 men, but those 100,000 could be trained to the highest possible standard. The Reichswehr, as the new German army was called, became an elite force where every private was trained to perform as a sergeant and every sergeant as an officer. When expansion eventually came, this small professional force would form the cadre of officers and NCOs for a much larger army. The Allies had inadvertently helped Germany create a perfectly structured training organization. The dissolved General Staff didn't really dissolve. It simply renamed itself the Truppenamt, or Troops Office, and continued its work under a civilian-sounding title. German military theorists continued developing doctrine, studying the lessons of the Great War, and planning for future conflicts. Some of the most innovative military thinking of the interwar period came from this supposedly non-existent staff. Then there was the matter of prohibited weapons. Germany couldn't build tanks or military aircraft on German soil under Allied supervision, but nothing in the treaty prevented German companies from building them elsewhere, or prevented German personnel from training on them in foreign countries. This is where one of history's strangest partnerships comes into play. In the early 1920s, Germany and the Soviet Union, two pariah nations isolated from the Western powers, began a secret collaboration under agreements that began with the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922 and expanded through covert military protocols. Germany gained access to Soviet territory for weapons development and training that would have been impossible at home. Deep in the Soviet Union, far from Allied inspectors, German pilots trained on military aircraft at the secret Lipetsk airfield. German tank crews practiced with prohibited armored vehicles at Kazan. German officers experimented with poison gas at Tomka. In exchange, the Soviet military gained access to German technical expertise and training methods. This collaboration was mutually beneficial and remained largely secret until the 1930s. It allowed Germany to maintain cadres of pilots, tank commanders, and technical specialists who would have been impossible to create under the treaty restrictions. When Hitler eventually threw off those restrictions in the mid-1930s, Germany didn't have to start from scratch. They had a foundation of trained specialists who could expand programs rapidly. German industry also found ways to prepare for rearmament while technically complying with the treaty. Krupp, Germany's premier arms manufacturer, couldn't build artillery or tanks in Germany, but it could maintain its engineering staff and design capabilities. Krupp established subsidiaries and partnerships in neutral countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, where German engineers could continue working on military designs without violating the letter of the treaty. Blueprints for tanks and artillery were prepared and refined, waiting only for the political moment when they could be manufactured. The Allied Control Commission, tasked with verifying German compliance, faced fundamental problems. The commission was understaffed, underfunded, and had limited access. More importantly, the political will to enforce the treaty's military clauses weakened quickly. Britain and France had their own concerns, their own economic problems, and their own domestic political pressures. By the mid-1920s, many in Britain particularly felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh and that some relaxation of restrictions was justified. This attitude, which would later be called appeasement, began not in the 1930s but in the 1920s. Germany exploited every ounce of Western war wariness and guilt. The Treaty of Versailles demanded that Germany pay reparations for the damage caused during the war. The final sum set in 1921 was 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical figure equivalent to roughly 42 billion in today's money. Germany claimed this was impossible to pay. Many economists, including John Maynard Keynes, agreed that the figure was unrealistic and would cripple German recovery. What followed was a decade of economic crisis, manipulation, and eventual restructuring that paradoxically helped Germany rebuild. The reparations crisis became the vehicle through which American investment flowed into Germany, modernizing the economy far beyond what would have been possible otherwise. Germany's initial response to reparations was to claim poverty, while simultaneously engaging in passive resistance. When Germany defaulted on payments in 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr Valley to seize coal and steel directly. Germany responded with a campaign of passive resistance, deliberately sabotaging their own economy to prove they couldn't pay. The government printed money to support striking workers, leading to hyperinflation so severe that a loaf of bread could cost billions of marks. The savings of the middle class were wiped out, creating social resentment that would later feed into Nazi support. But this crisis created an opportunity for restructuring. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 restructured Germany's reparations payments and, more importantly, opened the floodgates of American investment. American banks and corporations poured money into Germany throughout the late 1920s, more than Germany ever paid in reparations. These American loans funded the modernization of German industry, the construction of new factories, and the development of new technologies. Germany was essentially borrowing money from America to pay reparations to France and Britain, who then used that money to pay war debts to America. It was a circular flow of capital, but the infrastructure and industrial capacity built with those loans remained in Germany. By the late 1920s, Germany had one of the most modern industrial plants in Europe, more modern in many ways than those of the victorious powers. Their chemical industry, led by IG Farben, was the world's most advanced. Their steel production had recovered to pre-war levels. Their electrical and precision engineering industries were thriving. The economic crisis had forced a kind of creative destruction, sweeping away older, less efficient operations and replacing them with state-of-the-art facilities. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, hit Germany hard, but it also provided political cover for what came next. As American loans dried up and unemployment soared, the reparations system collapsed entirely. The Lausanne Conference of 1932 effectively ended reparations, with Germany paying only a tiny fraction of what had been demanded. Germany had modernized its economy with foreign loans, and then largely avoided paying back those loans or the reparations they were meant to fund. It was an economic strategy that worked brilliantly, if unethically. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Germany was still technically bound by the Treaty of Versailles, but the political situation had changed dramatically. The Depression had weakened the resolve of the Western powers. Britain and France were focused on their own economic crises. The Soviet Union was undergoing Stalin's brutal industrialization. The United States had retreated into isolationism. The international order of the 1920s was crumbling. Hitler moved cautiously at first, testing the waters to see how the Western powers would respond to treaty violations. In 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations Disarmament Conference and the League itself, claiming that other nations' refusal to disarm to Germany's level made the treaty's restrictions unfair. This was technically a violation of the treaty's spirit, but Britain and France did nothing beyond diplomatic protests. Emboldened, Hitler authorized open rearmament. In March 1935, he publicly announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, which had been secretly developing for years, and declared that Germany would expand its army to 36 divisions, far beyond the treaty's limit. This was a clear, unambiguous violation. The Western response was tepid. Britain, France, and Italy issued a joint protest at the Strasser Conference, but took no concrete action. Britain then undermined even this weak response by signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement later that year, which legitimized German naval rearmament up to 35% of British naval strength. This British decision was catastrophic for treaty enforcement. It signaled to Hitler that the Western powers were willing to negotiate away treaty restrictions rather than enforce them. It divided Britain from France and showed that Britain valued its own naval position more than collective security. Most importantly, it gave international legitimacy to German rearmament. With the seal of international approval, German rearmament accelerated dramatically. Military spending soared. The army expanded rapidly using the trained cadre from the small Reichswehr. The Luftwaffe went from secret development to operational squadrons in months. Tank production began in earnest using designs that had been prepared for years. Germany's modern industrial base, built with American loans, was converted to military production. Hitler employed economic methods that appeared miraculous but were actually unsustainable. He spent far beyond Germany's means, financing rearmament through creative accounting, IOUs to German businesses through MIFO bills, and the plundering of Jewish property. This military Keynesianism put millions back to work and created the appearance of an economic miracle, but it was built on debt and theft. The economy was being structured for war because only conquest and plunder could make it sustainable. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 was another test. The Treaty of Versailles had demilitarized the Rhineland as a buffer zone protecting France. When German troops marched in, they did so with orders to retreat immediately if France responded with force. France didn't respond. This emboldened Hitler further and confirmed his belief that the Western powers lacked the will to enforce the treaty. By 1939, Germany had transformed itself into a military superpower. The Wehrmacht consisted of over 50 divisions including elite panzer and mechanized units. The Luftwaffe had thousands of modern aircraft. German industry was producing weapons at rates that matched or exceeded the Western powers. All of this had been accomplished in less than 7 years of open rearmament, built on the foundation of secret rearmament and industrial preparation that had never really stopped. The question that haunts history is not how Germany rearmed, but why the Western powers allowed it to happen. The answers are complex, involving war, wariness, economic crisis, political division, strategic miscalculation, and moral failure. Britain and France had lost an entire generation to the Great War. The British had lost nearly 900,000 men, France over 1.3 million. These losses created a profound aversion to the possibility of another war. British public opinion in the 1930s was overwhelmingly pacifist. The Oxford Union famously voted that they would not fight for king and country. The phrase, "never again," wasn't just a slogan but a deeply felt conviction. Politicians who wanted to confront Germany risked electoral defeat from populations that wanted peace at almost any price. There was also genuine guilt about the Treaty of Versailles. Many in Britain, influenced by economists like Keynes, believed the treaty had been too harsh and that Germany had legitimate grievances. This created a moral foundation for appeasement, the policy of making concessions to Germany in hopes of satisfying their demands and avoiding war. When Hitler claimed he only wanted to reunite German-speaking peoples or correct the injustices of Versailles, many in the West believed or wanted to believe him. The Great Depression consumed political attention and resources. Britain and France faced massive unemployment, social unrest, and political instability. Military spending had been slashed in the 1920s and early 1930s as governments prioritized economic recovery. When Hitler began rearming, Britain and France were in no position to respond militarily. They would have needed years to rebuild their own forces, and by then Germany would be even stronger. This created a vicious cycle where inaction begat more inaction. There was also the problem of strategic priorities. Britain was a global empire with concerns far beyond Europe. The rise of Japan threatened British interests in Asia. Italy's aggression in Africa worried Britain about Mediterranean security. The Soviet Union represented a communist threat that many conservatives feared more than Nazi Germany. Some British politicians, including members of the aristocracy, saw Hitler as a bulwark against Bolshevism. This created a strategic confusion where Britain couldn't decide whether Germany was the primary threat or a potential ally against communism. France faced its own set of problems. French politics in the 1930s were chaotic, with governments rising and falling frequently. France had invested heavily in the Maginot Line, a defensive fortification system that reflected a defensive mentality. French military doctrine had learned the wrong lessons from World War I, preparing to fight the last war rather than the next one. France also depended on alliances with Eastern European states like Poland and Czechoslovakia, but these alliances created obligations that France was increasingly unable or unwilling to fulfill. The policy of appeasement, most associated with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was not simply cowardice or stupidity. It was a rational, if ultimately failed, attempt to avoid war while Britain rearmed. When Chamberlain returned from Munich in 1938 claiming to have achieved peace for our time, by sacrificing Czechoslovakia, he knew he had bought time. British rearmament accelerated after Munich. When war finally came in 1939, Britain was better prepared than they'd have been in 1938, though still not prepared enough. But there was also moral failure. The Western powers had the ability to stop Hitler in 1936 when Germany was still relatively weak. They chose not to. They had the ability to defend Czechoslovakia in 1938 when the Czechs had a strong army and defensible borders. They chose not to. Each time they failed to act, Hitler grew stronger and bolder. Each concession taught Hitler that the West would not fight. By the time Britain and France finally drew a line at Poland in 1939, Germany had become strong enough that stopping her would require the very war they had sought to avoid. Germany's recovery and rearmament after World War I offers several enduring lessons about international relations, treaty enforcement, and the nature of power. First, treaties without enforcement mechanisms are merely paper. The Treaty of Versailles created obligations but no permanent means of ensuring compliance. The Allied Control Commission was temporary and underfunded. The League of Nations lacked both the will and the means to punish violations. Once the political will to enforce the treaty evaporated in the mid-1920s, the treaty became increasingly meaningless. This lesson would influence the creation of NATO and other post-World War II institutions, which built in permanent enforcement mechanisms rather than relying on temporary commissions. Second, economic interdependence can cut both ways. The flow of American capital into Germany in the 1920s was supposed to integrate Germany into the liberal international economy and make aggression economically irrational. Instead, it provided Germany with the resources to modernize their military-industrial base. The assumption that trade and investment automatically promote peace proved naive. Economic ties can be weaponized, and industrial capacity built for peaceful purposes can be converted to military use. Third, the treaty focused too much on limiting symptoms and too little on addressing root causes. It limited Germany's military but not their industrial capacity or their educational system. It took territory but left Germany strong enough to seek its return. It imposed reparations that created resentment without actually weakening Germany economically in the long term. A more effective approach might have been either much harsher, actually destroying German industrial capacity, or much more lenient, integrating Germany into a cooperative European framework from the start. The middle path of moderate punishment created the worst of both worlds. Fourth, the treaty's failures were not inevitable. At multiple points, different decisions could have led to different outcomes. If the Allies had enforced the treaty rigorously in the 1920s, secret rearmament would have been much harder. If they had responded militarily to the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, Hitler might have been overthrown by his own generals, who were terrified of Western intervention. If they had defended Czechoslovakia in 1938, Germany would have faced a two-front war it wasn't ready to fight. History is full of contingencies, not inevitabilities. Finally, there's the human element. Germany's recovery was powered by millions of Germans who worked, innovated, and rebuilt. Some were enthusiastic Nazis, many were not. The economic desperation of the Depression made Hitler's promises appealing. The humiliation of Versailles made his nationalism resonant. Understanding how Germany became strong requires understanding not just policies and treaties, but the lived experience of ordinary Germans navigating economic crisis and political chaos. When German tanks rolled into Poland in September 1939, they represented the culmination of 2 decades of careful planning, secret development, international collaboration, treaty evasion, and Allied failure to respond. Germany had never been as weak as the Treaty of Versailles intended. Their industrial base remained intact, their technical expertise survived, and their determination to reverse their defeat never wavered. The treaty's restrictions provided temporary limitations but not permanent solutions. Every restriction created an incentive for Germany to find workarounds, and they found them through secret collaboration with the Soviet Union. Industrial preparation disguised as civilian production, training programs that prepared cadres for rapid expansion, and exploitation of every loophole in the treaty's language. The Western powers failed not because enforcement was impossible, but because they lacked the sustained political will to enforce what they had created. War weariness, economic crisis, political division, and strategic miscalculation all contributed to a policy of concessions that taught Hitler that aggression would not be punished. The result was a Second World War even more devastating than the First, claiming over 70 million lives and reshaping the global order. Germany's rapid rearmament between 1933 and 1939 transformed a regional power into a force that would conquer most of Europe before finally being defeated at tremendous cost. The story of how Germany became so strong after losing World War I is ultimately a cautionary tale about the difficulty of maintaining peace, the importance of treaty enforcement, and the consequences of allowing grievances to fester while providing the means for revenge. It's a reminder that preventing war requires not just winning the last one, but maintaining the vigilance and commitment necessary to preserve the peace afterward.